And the real work is done in the parse. So parse is called out when I have a virtual file matching a dash beans.properties file. And then it's my responsibility to translate that file into that kernel deployment object, which basically would be what we're doing with this highlighted deployment builder. So that's where the real work is. I mean, that's where you'd have to have a little bit of knowledge of what our kernel deployment and underlying beans metadata model looks like. But basically, you're just going to take a bean, set the bean class, and then create the properties, and then set those into beans associated with the kernel deployment. And that once you've done that, then you're basically outputting that and telling our existing JBoss component deployer for kernel deployments to take that and translate that into a kernel deployment with POJOs installed into the microcontainer, just the same as if that had been a JBoss beans.xml. Right? And so you can do that in many different ways. So any mechanism I have for creating a kernel deployment can be introduced at any layer prior to our existing real deployer to have POJOs created with all the features of the JBoss microcontainer, including dependency resolution, class loading models, AOP support, all that. It's just a question of how you build the metadata and then introduce that into the deployer chain. So one of the unique things, and has historically been a problem with the JBoss 4 line, is that you would often want to have coarser-grained dependencies between deployments themselves. Right, so in JBoss 4X we had a notion of dependencies, but it was basically I had to specify dependencies between MBeans, right? So if I had a war depending upon an EJB, I basically had to have a JBoss web.xml that said I depend on this EJB, and I'd have to know its JMX name. Well, in our new deployment model, the deployers themselves are basically a custom component model. So they have their own state machine that goes through those deployer stages that I described, and you can actually have dependencies between stages and deployments. So I can say that my war depends on an ear. I can also say my war depends on fine-grained components as well. So, and that will be properly managed by the JBoss microcontainer, just the same as I manage dependency injection across any of the other component models, the EJB model, our POJO MC model, our service MB model, etc. And that would be an example of how easy it is to introduce custom component models, or basically customized state machines that rely on the dependency injection and management features of the microcontainer to handle that particular a custom use case. All right. One of the best examples of how we actually utilize this new framework is the addition or implementation of our JSR 299 WebBeamWorks container and framework is solely based on one addition to the JBoss application server that ships out of the box, and that's a collection of deployers. So we have a WebBeans.deployers that basically has a bunch of custom deployers along the lines that I've been talking about. So there'll be a custom parsing deployer that parses the new beans.xml file. It's just externalized view of the annotations introduced in WebBeans. I'll have a custom class loading deployer that says if this is a WebBeans deployment, I always want an isolated class loading model. And it also adds the jar specific to the WebBeans API to that class loader. And introduces an EJB interceptor and custom servlet listeners, to properly handle the lifecycle callbacks and other behaviors that the WebBeans model adds to the existing EJB and web containers. And then we integrate with a number of the existing MC runtime elements to better utilize existing facilities like scanning for annotations and that type of thing. So for example, if you look at, if you download the WebBeans preview and then run its update of the JBoss application server, basically you're going to see a WebBeans deployer that includes these type of customized deployers, right? And again, they're doing things like introducing new metadata file identification, so that's what the first one does in terms of beans.xml. Adds new discovery and scanning deployers that basically will look for the new JSR 299 annotations, right? So I don't necessarily need any XML. I can have, a new custom deployment that just basically includes GSR 299 annotated components, right? So that would be identified through that mechanism. The URI integration deployer is introducing the WebBean specific classes onto that deployment's class path, right? So it is an isolated deployment where we're not necessarily having, in the old days, typically we'd have to push those jars up to the server lib directory. Well, here we're dynamically adding them, and those jars actually live in the WebBeans deployer, but they haven't been exposed to all the other applications, right? So you have a lot of control over how you introduce new classes into a deployment model. And then a number of post-metadating processes that actually, or deployers actually manipulate the standard or our existing JBoss EGB jar metadata, our web component model metadata, and to introduce new things like new valves, new interceptors, augment the annotations that are relevant for it, etc. Right, so this demo is pretty trivial, but basically all it's going to show is, once that WebBeans deployer was added to the JBoss servers, servers deployers directly, once I start that up, I basically extended the server to support the GSR 299 model. That's the only place I need to introduce that. Ideally, we should actually even be able to deploy that deployers to the deploy directory and dynamically add and remove a new component model, based on that mechanism. Basically, what we're trying to illustrate is that you can take an off-the-shelf install of the JBoss application server and introduce a completely new component model that not only is introducing a new component model, but is also extending existing JBoss component models. That's the EGB container, the web container, our class loading. It's utilizing our class loading model, our injection framework, all that. So it's very trivial to add new customized behavior to existing Java EE technologies via this VDF mechanism. Thank you.